Okay, so we're back. I look forward to talking through the Arrington stuff with you when I see you on Friday. And now let's get into kind of the logistics of how to organize and draft your argument once you understand the research. So, the first thing the reader will read in your argument section is the roadmap. Similar to last semester, the roadmap will be like one or two paragraphs. It will be located under the argument heading and before any point headings. And you will use the roadmap to introduce the components of the argument and analysis that follows. So it's essentially an introduction to your argument. And you can use the roadmap for a variety of reasons. So the roadmap should include a summary of the rule and controlling authority that defines the rule. And when I say big R rule, I mean the overarching rule, including all the factors and elements involved in that big overarching controlling rule. In the roadmap, you also want to introduce any favorable information that affects the application of the rule. That could be policy, that can be prior commentary about what the rule's purpose is, etc. And then you can use the roadmap to explain the status of any elements, factors, or exceptions that you're not going to address. So this is where you focus the reader on the specific issue or issues that you are going to argue. And in your current trial brief, you have one issue to argue. So you're going to start with the big rule and then narrow the reader's focus to the specific issue in your case. And after you do that, after you narrow the focus, then you provide a short, you can't see that, there you go. You provide a short summary of your argument for each relevant point. So once you've identified the very specific issue that you'll be arguing, you give kind of a roadmap of how you're going to work your way through that argument. And then hopefully you follow the roadmap that you set out for yourself. Okay, so after you introduce your big R rule and narrow the reader's focus to the specific issue you'll be arguing, you have to start with a rule explanation. You've got to start telling the reader what rules control resolving that issue. And just like last semester, you want to separate the explanation from the application of the rule to your facts. So as always, you will explain everything the reader needs to know about the rule before you apply it. And you want to provide enough explanation that your reader isn't left asking, well, what does that mean? And to that end, you should be using phrases like, in other words, to put the rules in plain English. Something I think a lot of you struggle with still, because it's hard and you're beginning lawyers, is putting rules into your own words. Sometimes you struggle because you don't understand the rules, so you just rely on what courts have said. And sometimes you think you're supposed to sound fancier than is necessary. So if you're struggling with how to phrase a rule, think about how you would explain the rule to me if you just came into my office and I said, okay, well, what's that rule? And then the words that come out of your mouth, I would assume, would be relatively straightforward because we're just having a conversation. And you can use the same kind of techniques, the same conversational tone to describe rules in your writing. So even if you're going to quote a court because you want to have some like quoted authority in there, I always recommend following up the quote with an in other words statement to flesh out what that rule means in plain English. So another way to think about your obligations when it comes to each major point of law, meaning each issue that you're going to have to address, is that each section should start with a conclusion, the conclusion you want the reader to draw. Then you should state the rule. So provide a general statement of what the rule is, and then go another step further and explain the rule. You've stated it, but then what does that mean and how does it work? And that rule explanation should still be in general terms, not referring to any specific case or court, just telling the reader in general terms, how does the rule work? What does it require? Going beyond just a mere statement of the rule. Then you would provide a rule illustration. This is where you get into the specifics about a prior case that has applied or considered the rule that you're talking about. And only after you've done all of that do you move into the facts. You will start your fact application with a factual conclusion, meaning how does this rule apply in your case? And then you'll apply the rule to your case using explicit comparisons between your case and a prior case, or if there is no prior case, using explicit references to the language of the rule you just introduced. And then finally, you remind the reader about your conclusion. What do you want the reader to take away from your rule analysis? Okay. So you guys have practiced on multiple occasions how to draft rules, how to explain rules, and how to illustrate rules. What's different now is that you're going to have to draft rules persuasively. And to do that, you want to tell the court how the case law supports your position, or how the law generally supports your position. And if possible, you want to use both cases that are good for you or cases that that you know are going to be cited by the other side, and try to find a way to use those cases to support what you want to have happen as opposed to what they want to have happen. And I think, sorry, just leafing through my book here. Never mind. Forget that. Okay, so when you're developing persuasive rules, your goal is to explain the rules from your perspective. Explain the parts of the rule that are most helpful, and part of this comes with deciding whether a narrow version or a broad interpretation of the rule fits your argument better. We talked a lot last semester about kind of how you can form rules to be either very specific or very broad, and you kind of had to find a balance when you were being objective. This semester, you have to pick one, and you want to pick the one that best suits the needs of your client. So if a rule has very specific requirements and you want to say that the rule doesn't apply here because the requirements aren't met, then you want to create a version of the rule that's very narrow and specific. If you're on the other side, you want to create a version of the rule that's broader, that isn't as limited. You want to kind of generalize the requirements more so that you can argue that it does apply. So you have to figure out how to explain the rules from your perspective. When necessary, you're going to have to develop new rules that advance your argument. This happens when there's no clear rule or interpretation of a factor or requirement. And when that happens, you're going to have to synthesize a rule. And you guys are facing this right now, right? Because there is no clear rule about whether the Castle Doctrine defense applies to someone in Isla's position. So what you have to do is look for implicit rules, what can you take away from other cases that have faced a similar situation as to how they've made a similar determination. You also want to look at patterns of judicial thinking about the kind of defense that she is claiming. And make sure you're looking at what the courts do, not just what they say. So you're going beyond just lifting quotes from cases. You're looking at the cases to think about, based on what this court has done, how is this going to impact future cases? Or how can I say it should impact future cases? So this is probably the hardest part about being a lawyer, is trying to make the implicit rules explicit. And then finally, you have to acknowledge unfavorable law in a favorable way. You do this by using it to your advantage if possible, trying to spin a case as being actually helpful to you and or completely inapplicable. You want to try and present the unfavorable law in a light that actually helps your case. On the other hand, you don't want to make your opponent's argument for him or her, so you want to avoid repeating what you think they're going to argue and just focus on how the existing law is helpful to you and how any other interpretation of that law is wrong. All right, so here's an example of how you might take a rule and frame it favorably for your client. So the basic rule is, I think this is a Title IX regulation, and it says, this is the objective rule, okay? It says, a recipient which operates or sponsors interscholastic athletics shall provide equal athletic opportunities for members of both sexes. In determining whether equal opportunities are available, the director will consider, among other factors, 1, whether the selection of sports and levels of competition effectively accommodate the interests and abilities of both sexes. So that's the basic rule you get out of the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. Now let's say that you are a plaintiff, a female athlete at a university, suing your university for failing to fulfill its obligations under Title IX. That plaintiff would draft a rule like this, talking about discrimination. A university discriminates against its female students if it fails to effectively accommodate the interests and abilities of its female students. So you would draft a rule that focuses on when a university discriminates, because your claim is that your university has discriminated. On the other hand, if you are representing the university, you are going to focus on compliance. So your version of the rule is that a university complies with Title IX if it effectively accommodates the interests and abilities of its female students. So you're creating a rule focusing on kind of the gist of your argument, and here the plaintiff athlete would be focusing on discrimination and when that exists, because she's arguing it did. And if you're the defendant, you would be claiming that the university is in compliance with the title when they take certain steps, and they will be arguing that they took those steps. Okay, so now it's time to get that worksheet out again. You guys are gonna try, dang it, technology. All right. So you guys are gonna try questions 4 and 5 on your worksheet. And these ask you to take a statement and rewrite it to be more helpful to your client. So I'm going to end this here, and you're going to go work on number 4 and 5 on the worksheet, and then come back and finish class with video 3. Woohoo!